right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. My website is weekendinterviewshow.com. If you want to hear any of the archives, I keep them all there for you in MP3 format. And I'm proud to introduce Bob Murphy. He is an adjunct scholar at the Ludwig von Mises Institute and the Mackinac Center for Public Policy. He teaches economics at Hillsdale College and is the author of Chaos Theory, 2 essays on market anarchy, and the online novel Minerva. His website is bobmurphy.net. He also writes for Mises.org, the Ludwig von Mises Institute, LouRockwell.com, Antistate.com, and StrikeTheRoot.com, and there's dashes in StrikeTheRoot.com. Welcome to the show, sir.
Hi, glad to be here.
That's great to talk with you. Let's start right there with striking the root. What exactly is the root that you're striking there, Mr. Murphy?
Well, as the website says, it's from a Thoreau quote. It's supposed to be striking at the root of evil. And so in my articles, they're not so much economic, although occasionally they are, but it's usually to try to get to the heart of the matter, that beyond a specific policy dispute, just to usually, go to the core and say, well, why is the government even getting involved in this sort of activity in the first place?
Interesting. For years and years, actually, I always, without knowing the Henry David Thoreau quote, I often made sort of the same kind of, or had the same kind of sentiment, that what we really got to do is strike at the root of the problem, which is the Federal Reserve System, which I thought was, as long as the government and the banks have this partnership where they can create money out of nothing for each other, we're not ever going to be able to get anything done, that we got to get rid of that first. And I guess really what you're doing is you're just going one step further, and you're saying, yeah, well, it was Congress that passed the Federal Reserve Act, and that's our real problem, is that we've got a nation state, and the central bank came second. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's once you concede the principle that it's okay for people to take your money at gunpoint, basically, as long as they're going to do something good with it, and then the question is just, well, is that a good program, or should they spend it some other way? I think at that point you've already lost.
What do you mean, let others take your money at gunpoint?
I'm referring to the federal government, that the issue is not so much, is this particular spending program a good one or a bad one, or, oh, gee, they're really wasting my money over here, they should spend it on something important. That's the sort of debate that people typically have. And most of the writers at Strike the Root, that's not the sort of thing they concentrate on. That it's more, let's take it back a step and analyze the principle. Should there be this group of individuals, namely the government, who has the right to take our money? And if you disagree with it, let's say you're a strong opponent of the war in Iraq, and you say, you know what, I think I want my money to not go to that cause. That's not really your decision. And if you of course, did try to withhold your funds, then if you got caught, they could, in principle, send armed men to your house and arrest you.
All right, everybody. We're talking with Bob Murphy from the Ludwig von Mises Institute on the Weekend Interview Show. We'll be right back. My friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Bob Murphy. He's an adjunct scholar at the Ludwig von Mises Institute of Austrian Economics. His website is bobmurphy.net. And, sir, as we were going out to break, you were discussing taxation as violence, basically. You don't really have a choice. And I think most people hearing you say that might say, well, yeah, sure, but, death and taxes and all that, everybody's got to pay taxes, and what are you going to do, not have government?
You're right. That's entirely true. That is the typical justification. And if you had asked me that 10 years ago, I would have agreed with that sentiment. And that's what's interesting. A lot of the interesting work that's being done among certain Austro-libertarian, and that phrase means people who subscribe to the Austrian School of Economics and are politically libertarian. That's a lot of the cutting-edge work that's being done, is to come up with mechanisms and proposals for, how could we have police services without the state providing them, or how would we be defended from foreign invasion? And so there's a lot of interesting work that's being done. If you go to the Mises.org website, there's plenty of things that are available for free online if people are interested.
Well, I wonder if you can sort of paint me a picture of what you think. Well, let's just say that we abolished the 50 states and the national government, and the land between Mexico and Canada was no longer a nation state. All the property had been privatized. How do you imagine the system working in a way that we don't just end up with warlords basically making their own new governments?
Okay, well, the thing that would prevent the rise of warlords is that there would be no single group that would have the dominant ability to take over, at least in the beginning. And you can sort of turn the question on its head and say, well, right now, we certainly do have one group that's in charge. Right? So it's ironic that people say, oh, no, I don't want to have anarchy, because then one group of guys might get all the guns and take over and tell the rest of us what to do and siphon off our earnings. So to prevent that horrible thing, let's establish the U.S. federal government.
Right, yeah, they're not warlords by any stretch.
Right. So, but to give you an answer that's not so glib, there are different proposals, of course, and this is what we argue about, but there seems to be a general consensus among people who believe in capitalism and private property in a free market sense that there would be insurance companies would get involved, and so they would. The crucial difference would be that there would still be police agencies providing security, but that would all be contractual, at least with respect to their own clients. Okay, so right now it's not merely that the government uses violence against acknowledged lawbreakers, but even law-abiding citizens, they have to give a certain percentage of their income over to the government, or else armed men come to their house, as I alluded to before. And so the difference under a private property scenario would be that people would subscribe to voluntary agencies, and because there wouldn't be that ideological background, people would know, well, these are just private companies, and so if one group just violated its contractual responsibilities or limits, at least people would realize, yes, they're definitely an outlaw group. Whereas now when the government exceeds its authority, the government does all kinds of things that aren't constitutional, and people don't view them as necessarily criminal, or at least not very many people do. So, again, it's not correct to say, oh, well, let's look at human nature under my sort of ideal world and then not worry about that issue when it comes to the government. The question is just which system would be more likely to contain people with ambitious and who want to take over. And I think if you had a decentralized approach where the guns were distributed more uniformly, then it would be that much harder for a power-hungry individual to take over.
So you're not some utopian who just kind of has this daydream of everybody, joining some wonderful brotherhood of mankind and deciding not to have conflicts anymore and some kind of Star Trek garbage. Like, I think most people probably, they hear anarchy, they think of a red Che Guevara shirt and how one day when there's no property and no government, everybody will stop fighting.
Right, that's exactly true. And admittedly, there are plenty of people who call themselves anarchists, and they actually have some historical justification that they were using the term before people like Murray Rothbard and modern people who are for private property were using the term. But yes, that some people who call themselves anarchists, they think that I'm a sellout. They think, oh, because that guy Murphy believes in private property, he still believes in exploitation and hierarchies in society. Let's get rid of all that. Whereas what I am for is just unbridled private property, and that you can take the language of the founding fathers and the things that this country ostensibly stands for and just push it and say, yeah, if it's good for there to be liberty and freedom and the autonomy of the individual, let's just push that to its logical conclusion. And if the 13 colonies were allowed to secede and have self-government, well, then why can't my neighborhood secede and have self-government if we don't think that the government is at large is representing our interests? Okay, so that's the difference. And yes, as you say, there are plenty of people who we could say are utopians that think that they're pure pacifists and think if we just laid down our weapons and everything would work itself out. And that's not true of the modern anarcho-capitalist movement. They do still see a role for private defense agencies. It's just that they don't think in order to provide security, you need to have special exemptions. In the same way that the market is certainly capable of providing automobiles, and it's not that you need to have the right to tax people to make sure you can get the job done. And so in the same way, you can still hire people who are sharpshooters and who are good at providing security for banks and so forth, and they don't need to have the ability to tax their clients. Those can all be voluntary transactions.
Well, one thing good about market anarchy would be if anarcho-socialist types want to live in the commune, well, they can just buy private property and be communists all they want on it, right?
Yeah, certainly. And so, and I have made some, I must admit, unsuccessful attempts to branch out and to try to build bridges, as it were, between the different groups who are united in their opposition to the current activities of the federal government. But as I say, it's not just the anarcho-socialists. It's also, I have to admit, the people on my side of the fence, so to speak, that we get bogged down, as the cliche would go, and we argue about little theoretical fine points, even though all the people in that sort of disagreement are agreed that it's wrong what the U.S. government is doing in Iraq, for example, or the budget deficit right now is just immoral.
It really is interesting how, you can really read an essay by Lew Rockwell and an essay by Noam Chomsky, and they're both really making the very same points about the mercantilism and the warfare state, and yet at their core, their fundamental definition of liberty are opposite of each other. To Lew, owning property is the definition of being free. To Noam Chomsky, owning property is the definition of being a tyrant over somebody else.
Right, that's true, and I should say that I'm not an expert in Chomsky's views on this, and so I don't want to put words into his mouth, but certainly the anarcho-socialists, they agree with the right wing, the old right, people like Lew Rockwell, when it comes to, as you say, criticizing actions by the federal government, for example. But it's true that, so for someone like Lew Rockwell, just to continue the analogy you brought up there, would object and say the government, these politicians are imposing their rule on us, and they're making decisions, and they're ordering us about, and we have no autonomy to make our own decisions. But by the same token, somebody like Noam Chomsky would probably say, an absentee landlord, he is ruling over the people who are squatting on his land, and he has the arbitrary ability to tell them, no, you're not allowed to pick an apple off of my tree there, and you have to starve to death. And so it's an understandable viewpoint, but I think it just overlooks the insight that economists have touched upon, that unless you have private property, that's really the bulwark of Western civilization, or any civilization, really. And then without private property, you're not going to have the division of labor, and you're not going to have the ability to even sustain a fraction of the population that we have in today's world. And so it's really not an issue to say, can we have private property or get rid of it?
So the division of labor there, why don't you elaborate about what you mean there exactly, how if we were to not have that division of labor, that civilization itself cannot stand?
Okay, sure. So the division of labor, what that means simply is that people specialize. So you as an individual, you certainly don't grow all of your own food. You don't make your own clothes. You don't build the car that you drive. That we specialize in what we're good at, or what we have the comparative advantage in, to use the terminology from economics. And the problem with the suggestion to abolish private property altogether, to say things like, well, we don't need to have this capitalist class, that let's just have people just go wherever they want. If you just find yourself on some farmland and you want to start growing tomatoes, well, then by all means go ahead and do that. And that no one else has the right to say to you, hey, that's my property, because of some imaginary line that's been drawn around the land. Okay, so if that's your worldview, then I'm saying it's not possible to have people specialize in what they want to do because you don't have property rights. And so it's, just to give you a simple example, that it wouldn't be possible to have large-scale agriculture the way we have in the United States right now if nobody is allowed to fence off a certain area and say, okay, this is mine, it's my property, I'm going to pay for the fertilizer, I'm going to take care of the land and grow it according to the optimal plant rotation, and then let it lay idle for a year to rejuvenate, and those sorts of things. You're not able to do that if there's no secure property rights. And so people would be tied to the land. You wouldn't be able to have the output per farmhand go up as it has historically under capitalism. And so consequently, you couldn't have all these people doing things like making computers and being software engineers if 95% of the population needs to work the land just to grow enough food for everyone else to survive.
I see. Well, Well, I'll go ahead and hold that question until we get back from this break. I'm talking with Bob Murphy. He's an adjunct scholar from the Ludwig von Mises Institute of Austrian Economics. He writes for Mises.org, LouRockwell.com, Antistate.com, and StrikeTheRoot.com. His own website is BobMurphy.net, and we got all kinds of different things to talk about: oil, housing, central banking, trade, Social Security, all kinds of great stuff. So stay tuned. It's the Weekend Interview Show. Welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Bob Murphy. His website is bobmurphy.net, and he's an adjunct scholar at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. The website there is Mises.org. He also writes for LouRockwell.com, Antistate.com, and StrikeTheRoot.com. And I want to get from theory into a little bit of actual practice here and see if I can ask you a bit about central banking.
Sure.
You've written a couple of pretty good articles about that. And, in fact, one of your statements that really jumped out at me was that all the standard macro models are nonsense, that economics is an art, not a science. It's to be dealt with more principles and intuition than mathematical equations. Is that your view?
Yes, it is. When it comes to trying to model the future, you really need to be careful when it comes to things that are part of the social sciences. And I think if I could just give you an analogy that might make it clear. So imagine that someone from the Department of Defense goes to a small rural area and says to those people, exactly 12 months from now, we're going to start testing new cluster bombs in your area. Those people would know, okay, we've got 1 year to get out of here, and they could make their plans accordingly. But in contrast, if Alan Greenspan holds a press conference and says exactly 12 months from now, we're going to print up $5 trillion in cash and just hand it out to people and let them go spend it, you wouldn't actually have a year to get ready for that calamity, because what's going to happen is everyone's going to say, okay, 1 year from now there's going to be all this new cash in the economy. That means prices are going to go up, so the value of the dollar is going to be dropping. So I better spend my dollars now before that happens. And so as soon as the press conference is aired, everyone's going to run out and start spending their money like crazy. And so the fear of the future inflation today would make prices go up. And so that's just an illustration of the fact that when it comes to things in the social sciences, you've got acting individuals and they have subjective expectations about the future. And so it's really hard to boil people down into mathematical equations, put them into a simplified model, and crank out predictions for what's going to happen 6 months from now.
It's sort of like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle or something, right? Where by measuring it, you change the outcome.
Yes, it is like that.
Okay, now, the purpose of the Federal Reserve System, if I am to believe my college economics textbook, is to smooth out the business cycle, because farmers all go for loans at the same time in the spring and, whatever different reasons, that we need an elastic currency that can expand and contract with the needs of the people, and that we need the central bank in order to expand and contract it just so much so that we smooth out those big booms and busts that have historically been so much trouble.
Exactly. That's the ostensible reason. And if you read the typical news commentary whenever the Federal Reserve does something, you always hear that sort of language that, the Fed, because of inflationary fears, the Fed wants to raise the interest rates to put the brakes on, but we want to have a soft landing. Or if unemployment's going up and consumer confidence is down, the Fed needs to loosen the money supply to, prime the pump, And so that's the idea that the government is this wise fine-tuning mechanism by which this wildcat unregulated market can be brought under control. And what's ironic is, if you just forget theory, we could certainly argue about the theoretical reasons that that's bogus, but just look empirically what's happened. There's this myth that the Great Depression was the outcome of laissez-faire policies, and only then did the government reluctantly get involved in managing the macroeconomy. But no, the Federal Reserve was established well before 1929, okay? And if you just look at that, it's totally in accord with the Austrian theory of the business cycle that the Federal Reserve was pumping in artificial credit which was lowering interest rates all through the 20s, and that was what gave the boom, the artificial prosperity of the 20s. And basically what was happening in a nutshell is that entrepreneurs were getting credit on easier terms than was really consistent with the actual fundamentals of the economy. And so they were starting all sorts of different projects, that the sum total of which there wasn't enough capital goods to finance. And so at some point, even the government can't cause capital goods to be created out of thin air, and so something's got to give, and that's when the bust happens.
So if we didn't have the central bank, how would it work? You just let any private bank create as much money out of nothing as they want?
Well, there's different proposals or different theories espoused by different individuals. So some people, yes, if you look at Friedrich Hayek, for example, the 74 Nobel Prize winner, he had a fairly radical proposal contained in this pamphlet called The Denationalization of Money, I believe. And yes, that was his idea. He wanted to have not merely individual banks being allowed to do whatever they wanted, but he wanted individuals to be able to issue their own currencies, so that you could issue things, pieces of paper called a Horton, and people could trade against the dollar with those things, and I could issue a Murphy, and that Hayek thought by removing it out of the monopoly position of the government and allowing individual firms to trade these things or issue these things, that there would be much more stability, because, of course, how would you attract customers to try to use your medium of exchange is you would pledge to maintain its purchasing power. And so it's true, Hayek would say, that gold historically has been a very excellent repository of value and has served as an excellent medium of exchange, but Hayek would argue that it's possible that one of these privately issued fiat currencies would be even better. Now, as you can imagine, some other members, even in the Austrian school, like Murray Rothbard, for example, find that proposal ridiculous, and they think, no, we should all just go back to 100% gold standard. So to answer your question, under his more moderate recommendation, the banks, you would be able to operate your own bank just like you could operate your own laundromat under laissez-faire, but you wouldn't get special privileges from the government to renege on your contract.
I see, and that's really the point too. All right, we'll be right back with Bob Murphy, wrap up about the Fed. No class. Welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton. I'm talking with Bob Murphy. He's an adjunct scholar at the Ludwig von Mises Institute, and he teaches economics at Hillsdale College. His website is bobmurphy.net, and you can read his archives at Mises.org, LouRockwell.com, Antistate.com, and StrikeTheRoot.com. Now, right when we got cut off by the dumb commercial there, sir, we were talking about how would it be if there was no central bank, and I can create my own currency and you can create your own currency, and it kind of sounds pretty scary, but then right before the commercial cut you off, you made the point that, sure, we'd be free to create as much money as we wanted, however, there'd be no government bailout.
Exactly.
And that really is the key point, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And just to clarify, some people who advocate getting rid of the Federal Reserve and the government's role in money don't envision privately competing fiat currencies. They think society would go back to a commodity standard, probably gold, if people were just allowed to do so, if the government didn't take such pains to divert them and to wean them off of a commodity standard. So, but going back to that point, yes, what's happened historically is that the banks were given special privileges. So, for example, you may remember from your, I don't remember what grade it would be, probably 8th grade or so, learning about the Great Depression, and among the many wonderful things that FDR did to save the United States from the specter of unregulated capitalism was he declared a banking holiday. You may remember that. And what that really meant was that depositors were not allowed to go into the bank and get their money out, that the banks were just allowed to close, and even though contractually when you give your money to the bank, they're supposed to give it back to you upon demand, FDR just said, no, you don't need to do that. And so it's not surprising then that in that climate the banks overextended themselves and made loans and didn't have reserves in order to be able to pay off their clients when they showed up. And that, of course, is the whole rationale of the fractional reserve system, where the banks don't have enough in their vaults to be able to satisfy all of their depositors should the need arise. And so all of the free market advocates of what's called free banking, they all, of course, are agreed that if we're still going to have a federal government, but it just wants to get out of the monetary arena or the banking arena, that you can certainly have free enterprise in banking, but you shouldn't get special privileges, that if you have contracts with your clients, namely depositors, and if you default, then you have to go out of business. Just like any other company, if it can't fulfill its contracts, then it goes under. And that in that environment, banks would be much more responsible than they are now.
It's interesting you say that. We actually have here in the radio studio at RBN, we have FDR's executive order, the banking holiday, taking us off the gold standard, actually leaning up against the wall here in the studio. Let's see. Under executive order of the President issued April 5th, 1933, all persons are required to deliver on or before May 1st, 1933, all gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates now owned by them to a Federal Reserve bank, branch, or agency, or to any member bank of the Federal Reserve System.
Yes, well, that's actually talking about a different dark episode. I mean, it's the same executive order, I'm sure, the same umbrella act, but what that's referring to, which I wasn't, is that in order to cement the government's ability to be able to do what it wants in monetary affairs, they needed to get off the gold standard. And what better way to wean people off of gold and get them to start using green pieces of paper as their money than to just say, okay, turn over all the gold to us or else those armed men are going to come after you. And so it's certainly not, it's just amazing that some apologists for fiat currency have made an argument somewhat like, well, look, right now people could use gold if they wanted to, and yet they choose to use the U.S. dollar, and so clearly the dollar must be a superior form of currency, but that overlooks sort of lock-in effect in the fact that it wasn't a voluntary switch off of the gold commodity to green pieces of paper with U.S. presidents on them. It was achieved at gunpoint, among other things, under FDR.
And basically what this executive order is doing is it's getting the government, i.e. the Federal Reserve, out of their obligation, which is to pay you in gold for your piece of paper, just like it said on it.
Exactly right. That's historically, the way people got these green pieces of paper, greenbacks, into circulation, and the way that that got off the ground was not that some wise president just decided, instead of using yellow nuggets, why don't we use these pieces of paper, and people just unilaterally switched over. That's not what happened. They initially were to be exchanged. They were redeemable in gold, and that's why people accepted them. They were just really a claim upon gold that could be redeemed at any point. And then during times of war and other emergencies, they would temporarily suspend that redemption. But now anybody who's under 30 or so, we don't even know what it was like before the gold standard was completely eliminated under Richard Nixon.
Now, there's a book called The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin about the Federal Reserve System. And he has a chapter in there called The Name of the Game is Bailout, where he says that basically what the Federal Reserve is it's a mercantilist cartel combination between the most powerful American banks and the national government. So that, say, for example, George Bush wants to spend $500 billion killing people in the Middle East that he doesn't have, and in fact depends on his so-called tax cut in order to get reelected. He's got to get that money from somewhere, so he goes down to the Federal Reserve and borrows it. And at the same time, the banks that are the member banks in the Federal Reserve, if they have problems, they make bad loans and are in danger of having to close their doors, then the Federal Reserve creates a bunch of money out of nothing to bail them out. Is that basically your understanding of the Federal Reserve?
Yes, I'm not familiar with the book you cited, but that certainly sounds to be a cogent analysis. So what happens, the way you teach it in principles at least, is you say that it certainly is a cartel, that you and I couldn't just go form a bank and get and integrate it into the Federal Reserve System, that you certainly need political connections. And the government, when it runs a deficit what does that mean? It means that the government is spending more money than it's collecting in tax revenues. And so how does it make up that shortfall? Well, like any business even, it issues IOUs, treasury bonds, things like that. And so it needs someone to give them cash now in exchange for those debt instruments. And one of the prime people that will buy that will be commercial banks. And so they'll buy that, and then what they do is they take those treasury IOUs and then they deposit it, and then they can get Federal Reserve notes in exchange for that. And they can get credit with the Federal Reserve central bank, as it were. And so that the banks, the high-level banks, they have deposits not with another bank but with the Federal Reserve. And then it is true that, yes, ultimately, if a bank has customers who show up at its counter and they want their money, the bank, as part of its reserves, it has actual cash in the vault. Or if that runs out, the government also says, oh, if you have deposits with the Federal Reserve itself, then you can count that as part of your reserves. And so ultimately, I don't know how often in actual practice this happens, but if they needed to use that, then the government would literally just, create the deposits out of thin air, that they could just go to their ledger on the computer and just enter a bunch of zeros, if in principle it came to that. So
well,
sorry?
Oh, I was just going to say, as long as it runs like that, that basically encourages all the banks to run as close to the red line as they can every night, right? As long as the government's there to back them up?
Yes, it certainly does push them in that direction. Now, I think in actual practice, banks aren't always fully loaned up, as I believe the phrase is. So in other words, the government does require them to have a certain reserve requirement. And so, for example, if you have a total of $100 billion of deposits, so people, if they look at their checkbook and they think that they have a certain amount on deposit with this particular bank, if you added up all that amount, and that's $100 billion, then if the reserve ratio, let's say, is 10%, that means the bank needs to have $10 billion either in cash in the vault or deposit with the Federal Reserve. And so that's a legal requirement that the government sets. But it does happen that sometimes banks have more than the legal minimum. And there are various reasons. Just I think it could be awkward if the banks did press up against that and they had a problem. And you don't want to continually be getting bailed out, because that just doesn't look good just in terms of your reputation vis-a-vis the other bankers and so forth. But it certainly is true the entire system keeps banks much more insolvent than I think they would be under a completely laissez-faire system, where if you fail, there is no person guaranteeing you and bailing you out, and you just go out of business.
Do you think it ever happens that the Federal Reserve set interest rate matches what the free market would probably have as its interest rate? Is it always, at least a few points off of where it should be?
Well, it's a tough question to answer. I suppose it's possible that just randomly once in a while it does happen to hit the same number, but it's really because the entire structure has changed. It's hard to even interpret that question, because of course the course of history would have been different had there been no Federal Reserve, and so people would have saved more. And if the government hadn't been so profligate, there wouldn't have been so much assets wasted through government spending and things. So all of the fundamentals would have been different anyway. So it's hard to really know what does that question mean.
Right.
But no, I mean, I understand what you're getting at, and I don't think that the current interest rate is ever a good reflection of the economic realities. But again, nobody can know, and that's the whole problem, is that no individual can look at just the data and come up with what's the right number. So it's not merely that I'm saying Alan Greenspan is a dumb guy. No, he's not. And in terms of him being familiar with the macro statistics, he's much better than me, and possibly than any other individual you want to pick. But there doesn't need to be such a person in charge of the banking system or the monetary system, just like we don't pick one person to be in charge of brain surgery and have all decisions filter through him. That would be crazy. It's not just because we might pick the wrong guy. It's because there should be no such person. And so it's the same thing here, that you need to have all these individuals freely interacting in a private property system to determine what the interest rate ought to be. And it's impossible to do that through a centrally planned organization, which is basically what the Federal Reserve is.
Can government defy the laws of economics? I know a lot of times, markets and supply and demand curves and such are put in terms of gravity. and that there's just no way to counteract it. That if the government intervenes in the economy here or intervenes in the economy there, that all they're really doing is prolonging the consequences, basically procrastinating what's going to happen anyway. Is that always true, or are there times where government intervening here or there actually saves the day?
So that you started asking two questions. The first one, I would say no, depending on what we mean by the phrase an economic law. If you mean something that's derived from just first principles and using economic concepts and coming up with principles that I would teach to an introductory class at Hillsdale, let's say, well then no, the government can't counteract those things because, as I say, they're economic laws. We wouldn't be teaching them as laws if they were susceptible to being falsified. On the other hand, it is an empirical matter. Could the government ever fix a situation or make things better than it otherwise would have been? And to there, I would also say no. And you could either offer theoretical reasons, and just anyone studying history who's acquainted with free market economics, I think, could see that the government doesn't ever fix a situation. And it's not really surprising that, because basically what is the federal government? Again, amongst other ways to describe it, is a collection of individuals who have all the guns on their behalf. They raise their revenue through coercion, and they go about doing things that they think is best, and really the only thing holding them back is public opinion. But even there, it's pretty easy to couch whatever you want to do in the ideology of the day to sell your programs. I mean, you have a wide degree of latitude to implement your policies. And so in that framework, it's not so surprising then that the bureaucrats overlook all the subtle details of particular situations, and they come in and impose their so-called solution and end up making things worse.
Well, and the thing is, I think about, like, the reason why the politicians usually get away with a lot of this stuff is because it takes a while for the consequences to finally come. You can have a really inflationary policy, and the inflation doesn't come until 5 years after the politicians have all left office. You have a whole new crew responsible for dealing with the problem that they created.
Exactly. And that's really the problem with the justifications for Keynesian management of the economy after John Maynard Keynes, the economists who were in that train of thought and thought that they could use their expert fine-tuning to fix things, is that the typical response would be, okay, yes, we made mistakes in the past, but we've learned from them, and now we're going to go fix things in the future. And the problem there is they're failing to see that the very problems today are not just things that come out of nowhere, that they're actually caused by prior government interventions. Just as in the foreign policy sphere, as I'm sure listening to your show that I understand what your views on this are, that it's not as if the U.S. is just minding its own business and then all of a sudden, there's problems in Europe, and then we take care of that and mind our own business, and all of a sudden the Cold War is there, and all of a sudden, there's terrorism. That these things are not completely disconnected. It's the same thing when it comes to the economic arena, that all of these problems that the government's supposedly trying to fix the failed free market are the result of prior interventions.
Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about trade with the foreign nations. Let me guess and take a wild stab in the dark and assume that you've heard the phrase, they're taking our jobs, over and over again.
Right.
What's so bad about they're taking our jobs, or what's so good about it?
Okay, well, this is a big topic, of course.
And we only have a minute and a half before the next break, too.
Okay. In general, no. I mean, trading with foreigners, that's a great thing. It allows you to get products more cheaply than you could get from domestic suppliers. And if you just push the logic of the people who are opposed to trade to its extreme, then why do you ever go to the store? Aren't you giving away valuable jobs or tasks that you could be performing at home when you buy tomatoes? Well, then that means you're out of a job growing your own tomatoes. Okay, so if you push it to that far where you yourself are going to withdraw from trade, it's absurd. And then the question is, well, why are we drawing this boundary around the continental U.S. and saying, well, that's where we should have trade? You could say, well, should New York trade with California, or is that destroying jobs in both states? And no, that's absurd. So in general, no. Free trade promotes a rise in the standard of living among all people, and it is true certain groups could be hurt, at least in the short run, but if you had a policy of uniform free trade, then I think just about everybody would be better off at least a few years into it. Now, and maybe we can come back to this after the break, it is true that there are certain alarming trends. For example, the 2004 trade deficit, U.S. trade deficit, was $617 billion, and it's been high for some time now. And so there's a concern that these foreigners are going to stop accumulating assets denominated in dollars, because the trade deficit means we sell less to foreigners than we buy from them. And so the concern is that once they stop doing that, interest rates are going to go up, and that's going to affect the housing market. But maybe we can talk about that after the break.
All right, we will be right back after this break with Bob Murphy from the Ludwig von Mises Institute. All right, my friends, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. Wrapping up here with Bob Murphy, adjunct scholar at the Ludwig von Mises Institute and professor of economics at Hillsdale College. He's also the author of the books Chaos Theory, 2 essays on market anarchy, and the online novel Minerva, which you can find at striketheroot.com, which he writes for, as well as antistate.com, LouRockwell.com, Mises.org, and his own website is bobmurphy.net. So when we went out to break, sir, you were talking about the trade deficit and the possibility of the backlash coming soon would be massive inflation here. How exactly does that work? Okay, so
so your listeners can understand the situation. So we have these massive trade deficits. As I said, in 2004, it was $617.5 billion, and this year it looks like we're off to basically the same pattern. So what that means is U.S. consumers are buying more goods and services from abroad than they're buying from our workers. And so the question is, why are they tolerating it? These foreigners, why do they keep sending us more goods than we're sending in return? It's because they're buying up things like U.S. Treasury notes and things like that, and they're investing in U.S. corporations. And so that's keeping interest rates here lower than they otherwise would be. But at some point, the fear is these foreigners are going to stop stockpiling U.S. assets, and at that point, interest rates here would have to go up, because in order to induce people to be willing to hold them, if the demand for those things drops, the interest rate, the yield has to go up to make them more attractive. Now, why is that so bad? Because lately, as you know, there's this housing bubble, and in particular, the U.S. banks, the percentage of their total assets that are mortgage-related has just skyrocketed recently. I believe right now it's over 60%. Just to give you a frame of comparison, back in the 60s, it was below 20. Okay, so that the commercial banks, their assets, a much higher fraction of them are related to mortgage-related assets. And so if interest rates go up, that could destroy the housing market, and then that might really have impact on the banking sector. So but if the rates didn't go up, then we'd have massive inflation as all those dollars come flying back home. Oh, exactly. Yeah, if these foreigners who are accumulating actual dollar bills decide they want to start buying U.S. goods with them, then that would happen as well. Okay, well, let me ask you a little bit about, and I'm sure this is all pretty old hat to you, but the Paul Craig Roberts, Charles Schumer piece about the taking our jobs, and that the old economic models that justified free trade no longer work, because now the means of production, not just the things that you want to sell, but actually the means of production themselves are so easy to move around the world that basically what's happening is we're completely deindustrializing our country, and we're going to be completely bankrupt and destroyed if we don't protect. You got 40 seconds. Okay, great. The quick answer is that you're exactly right that Paul Craig Roberts, he has tried to phrase it as that it's these new developments that destroy the original classical doctrine for free trade. But I've tried to argue in my work that that's not true, that if you just think about it on the face of it, he's arguing that improvements in technology, that foreign workers becoming smarter, and that the ability to ship investment into other countries because their political regimes are more stable, that these are all cause for concern, and that if only we could go back to the days when, we didn't have high-speed communications and the workers in India and China were stupid, and that we had the possibility of expropriation in foreign land, and then the U.S. would be in a much more stable position. And that's just absurd.
It sounds self-refuting to me. All right, thank you very much for your time today. Bob Murphy, everybody, from the Mises Institute, MISES.org.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Thank you.